Hello and welcome to the
Fantastically Terrible Podcast. Booyaka!
This is episode 14, Black Heroes from the French Revolution, General Alex Dumas.
Today we'll continue to look at historical figures that have been tragically erased. But this time we're going to France during the time of their revolution. Now you may know the name Alexandre Dumas because he wrote some of the most beloved adventure books like The Three Musketeers and The Count of Monte Cristo. And we will talk about him on a future episode, including the racism he faced during his life. But for today, we're going to focus on his father, Thomas Alexandre Dumas, who preferred to go by Alex Dumas. Alex Dumas Sr. was born in Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti, in 1762. His mother was enslaved to his father, a minor French aristocrat, and a total asshat. In spite of his humble origins, Alex Dumas would become a 4-star general and a shining example of the first true age of emancipation. Alex's story begins with his father. His father is Alexandre Antoine David de la Pailleterie, and he goes down to Haiti to help his younger brother run a plantation.
Because he's a layabout in France and doesn't
Yes.
do anything, so he wants to mooch off his brother.
Yes, and they don't get along because he's just a layabout. So eventually they get into this violent confrontation. After this confrontation,
You mean they got a fight?
oh yeah, they got the fisticuffs.
Ah.
After the fisticuffs, he takes his slave, Marie Cosette Dumas, which is Alex's mother. He takes Alex, the kids, and everybody else that belongs to him, and goes off into the forested side of Haiti. And a lot of people think he's dead because the forested side of Haiti is where the enslaved Africans run to get away from the plantations.
And then you have this guy.
And you have this small aristocrat, or petite aristocrat, as they call him.
I guess it means he had the title but no money.
Right.
Okay.
And eventually there's a rumor that starts to circulate around the island. It eventually gets to him, and this rumor is, hey, there's an inheritance for him.
Isn't it funny that rumors about money cross the ocean, go from France all the way to modern-day Haiti,
Yeah.
because he smells out the dough.
Yeah, and money talks, I guess. So he resurrects like Lazarus. He's like, I am back. And he does something really unsavory and just disgusting because it's really hard to contemplate. He sells his daughter and
He
their
sells
children.
his kids.
He sells his kids. He pawns off Alex, though, because he loves Alex. Alex is like...
But
is
how
his boy.
horrible is that? His mother and brothers and sisters are sold for money,
Right.
and he really sees the potential in Alex, and he pawns him, as you said.
He pawns him.
So he has a contract that says, I have the option to come back for him.
He does this to get the money for the ticket to come back to France. And there's a heated debate in France, though, about whether Alex was a full-on slave, indentured servant, or whatever.
Well, if we go back to a wonderful book that we highly recommend called The Black Count, Napoleon's Rival and the Real Count of Monte Cristo, General Alexandre Dumas by Pulitzer Prize winner Tom Rees.
It's a fantastic book.
It's such a good book. He writes it like it's an adventure story. And that's where we first came across a lot of this. And he went to the actual source documents that were here in France.
Yep.
And he found the document from the ship's manifesto stating that Thomas Alexandre Dumas was a slave.
Right. So his father comes back here to France, collects his inheritance, and he comes back with this teenage son. And I guess I don't know, I want to throw him a bone. He had some sort of level of conscience. He starts to spoil his son rotten when he gets here. He buys him everything, an amazing apartment, clothes, you name it. He spoils him rotten, all the way up till he's 21. And Alex, when he's 21, reaches the height of, some say, 6'2". So he was a pretty big dude back then because...
And he was very talented.
Very
he excelled
talented.
in everything he did, which I think is why his father was so proud of him.
Right.
Because he was so extraordinary and
Right.
tall and good looking and athletic.
Right.
Very smart. So
But his father remarries, and his father's new wife says, hey, you're kind of spending this money on him. We need this for us. So he starts to cut back on the funds that he's giving to his son. Alex confronts his father and says, hey, I can't survive when you're giving me. So I want to go into the military. This causes a problem. His father does not want him to join the military because he didn't go to school for this. This is something that back then was an important thing. So eventually, Alex says, forget it, rebels. This ends up being the big rift between the two, to the point that Alex changes his last name from de la Pailleterie to his mother's name, Marie Cosette Dumas.
And that's the first time that we ever see the name Alexandre Dumas.
Right.
Is when he signs up for the military.
Right.
And he signed up right from the bottom, foot soldier.
Foot soldier.
He didn't take any titles.
None.
He wanted nothing to do with his father or anything to do with the title that he has.
Right. And you can kind of estimate, though, that if you're kind of pawned off like he was...
Oh, yeah. I mean,
there must be a lot of resentment.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So Alex Dumas arrives in France, and it's when everything's starting to happen. Things are opening up, which never were open before for people of color in France.
Right. Actually, one of the first integrated schools in the world was here in Paris. And a lot of the people from Haiti would send their children here if they could. And there were a lot of kids that were mixed that would come and do their schooling here.
That's right. So things really started opening up at this time, and Alex was so exceptional that he rose quickly in the military, had many victories right from the beginning. He earned the respect of his men because he was always right out front.
Right. He wasn't the kind of guy who led from the back.
That's right.
He wasn't the guy that sat there with the little toy models on his desk and said, okay, you're going to go and do this on this map and blah, blah, blah. No, he was the guy that was up front.
That's right. So he rose all the way to become a general.
Right.
And became a 4-star general.
The equivalent of it.
The equivalent in France of an American 4-star general.
Right. And he led 50,000 men during the French Revolution.
And this was white men. So that was the highest rank that a black man had in a white army, if you want to say, a European army.
To this day.
To this day.
To this day in the European continent.
And someone didn't reach the same equivalent of him until Colin Powell.
In the Western Hemisphere. Yeah. It's quite astonishing. So when we think of Colin Powell, really we should be thinking of Dumas.
That's right.
Prior to him.
That's right.
One of his great strategies or victories for France was the taking of Mount Cenis. Mount Cenis was critical for the French because they needed to get over into the Italian peninsula.
Yeah, this was in the Alps, and they were fighting the Austrians.
The Austrians.
And at this time, the Austrians had parts of Italy. There was no Italy at this time.
It was the Italian kingdoms, I guess.
There were different kingdoms. Yeah. And so the French were fighting the Austrians, the Republic against a monarchy.
Right.
And there was a huge strategic necessity
right.
to conquer and take these lands in the Alps. So they couldn't come into France.
It was essentially a fortress.
Absolutely.
And 2 other generals had tried and failed. And the high command just said, I don't know, just send Alex.
Send the kid from Haiti who's barely seen snow. Yeah, let's send him.
Right. So he gets there, staring at this massive mountain. I can tell you from having been to Switzerland that it's like you feel like you're in this pit because the mountain's so high. And he's staring at it, and Alex, being Alex, is not intimidated by it because he had learned how to ride up and down mountains in Haiti. And Haiti has the steepest mountains in the Caribbean.
He was fantastic on a horse, another one of his skills.
So he decides, his plan is, they're going to go around the mountain and surprise the Austrians.
Or the Italians.
The Italians.
Who are protecting it. Mm-hmm.
And they pull it off. And it's just brilliant. And this is talked about in military schools throughout the world.
Yeah,
throughout Europe.
He took 1,700 prisoners, 40 artillery pieces. He turned the artillery guns against the enemy, and they took the whole thing. It was almost an impossible feat, and he did that. The whole thing.
And
while he was there, he also received some interesting...
Oh, yes. This is hilarious. While he's there, he receives a letter from a man by the name of Maximilien Robespierre.
Robespierre, from the terror fame in France.
Right. And Rosepierres Letter is all excited. Hey, Alex, I got all these wonderful ideas. Can you come down and we can discuss them? And Alex writes back, no, I'm kind of busy right now.
Yeah, I'm busy fighting a war.
Right. A little more pressing.
And I hope he was a little bit afraid, like, you're the guy who gets people's heads cut off.
Well, ironically, the date that he was supposed to be there is around the time that Robespierre meets his end.
And he gets decapitated.
He gets
He
decapitated,
gets the
and I
guillotine.
think like 40 of the closest associates
Yeah, lucky he
are also
didn't go.
decapitated. So it was lucky he didn't go. He kept his head.
The author, back to that book I mentioned, Tom Reese, he mentioned one of the notes he found, one of the letters, was from Napoleon Bonaparte.
Right.
And at this time, Alex was actually ranked a little higher than him. They were both
Right.
generals. And Napoleon was asking him for guns and weapons. And Alex Dumas said, I can't spare any. I'm using them to fight right now in the Alps.
Right.
I don't know if it was the first time they wrote each other, but the first time we have a note of Alex
And
and
Napoleon,
Napoleon
like a
corresponding
correspondence.
together.
What's interesting too, though, is that Alex was a very principled man.
Extremely.
And back then, and this is something that's sad, and I hope it gets rediscovered, but he was seen as the embodiment of the revolution. The idea of liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, and brotherhood was something that resonated in him to the point that he did not torture prisoners of war, did not allow his men to do that. He did not allow his men to rape and pillage. He would get his men and teach them how to hunt and live off the land, which was very unusual for that time. Because back then it's like, hey, boys,
Yeah,
you won.
it's true. You took a
take it
town,
all.
you stole whatever you wanted. Absolutely.
And his view was, these people didn't really do
And
anything
he
to
really
us.
was for many at the time. Because he was from the colonies, he really did represent all three of those things.
All the hopes
Liberty,
that could be.
equality, and fraternity. He represented just in what he had
Yeah.
accomplished.
He was like the hope of what the Republic could be.
Exactly.
And
And he did such a wonderful job in the Alps that Napoleon himself actually congratulated him and compared him to an ancient hero of Rome for keeping the barbarians from invading France.
yeah, they did that a lot.
So they held him in high esteem, and he was very, very well known. And if you ever visit Paris and you go to the Arc de Triomphe,
Yes.
his name is listed like other heroes at the time.
Yes, and what's funny about that is that his name was not intended to be on that monument. But Napoleon died 1821. The Arc de Triomphe is completed 1836. And his friends press the architects to put his name up there. I guess they're like, well, Boss didn't get his elephant because that's what the Arc de Triomphe was supposed to be. And two, hey, who cares? We'll just put his name up.
I'll just clarify a little bit. Napoleon didn't want the Ark. He wanted an elephant.
He wanted an
because
elephant.
it was an homage to
Hannibal
Hannibal and his crossing of the Pyrenees
and the Alps.
and the Alps.
And the Alps.
So he died, and they said, no way, we're going to make an Ark, and we are going to put everyone's name, including General Dumas.
Right. They just thought it was tacky.
So we're kind of touching on a bit of animosity between Napoleon and Dumas. Let's
Yes.
expand on
So what happens?
a little bit of that.
How do we go from him saying, hey,
Exactly.
you're this
You're
great
like
hero,
this ancient Roman god.
to I don't want your name on this monument.
Exactly.
So Napoleon launches an expedition to Egypt. He brings artists, engineers, all sorts of different minds. Of course, the military, because it's really an invasion.
Yeah, they said it was to liberate the Egyptians.
Right.
But once they arrived there, Dumas instantly questioned.
Right. He did not buy it completely.
He didn't buy it, and when he saw that they weren't doing anything to establish a republic there to give them freedom and democracy, liberty, fraternity, and he was openly criticizing Napoleon. One of Dumas's weaknesses,
Well, it was his positive trait, but it was also his weakness.
is he wore his heart on his sleeve and he said what he thought, which are
Yeah.
good qualities, but they're also qualities that can get you in trouble.
It particularly happens when he's sitting in a tent one afternoon in Egypt and he's having some fruit, and some of the other generals come in and start complaining about Napoleon. And Dumas, of course, is involved in this conversation. Unfortunate for everybody in that tent, one of Napoleon's guys happens to be walking by, stops, overhears the conversation, and starts deciphering, oh yeah, that sounds like this guy. Oh, that's definitely Dumas. And then goes and rats out Dumas to Napoleon and says, hey, these generals over here, they're backbiting you.
That's right. And when they first arrived, the impression of the locals there, which were
The Mamelukes.
the Mamelukes, they saw Dumas on his horse. He's tall, he's statuesque, he's commanding. And then they saw this little guy,
Right.
And so they instantly thought Dumas was in charge.
Right.
And then they had to be told Napoleon was. So that already got under Napoleon's skin.
Well,
Then everyone kept looking to Dumas like he was the leader.
Right. And I mean,
And then he hears from this little spy of his that he's saying bad things about him.
he was saying bad things to his face too. Not bad, but he was confronting him.
Because he held up to the ideals of the French
That's right.
Revolution, and Napoleon was just using it to his advantage.
Yes, which brings us to the next point.
Yeah.
Napoleon ditches the military in Egypt, returns back to France, meets up with his brother who lied about his age to get into the National Assembly.
So yeah, a lot of people don't realize it wasn't just Napoleon. His brother was in the French government. So you had a guy in the military, and then you had an inside guy.
Yes, so all the wonderful historical fiction intrigues.
Yeah, oh, it's such a great story.
And then you have...
So you have all of these heroes of the Republic, or many of them, and Napoleon sends them all to Egypt and then abandons them and takes off and goes back to Paris. Now, they didn't know he was doing this to establish his power.
Right.
As we later know, he became the emperor.
And
so
there's one key thing, too. He meets with the plantation owners from Haiti. Because
this is Napoleon.
Because in 1794, the French Republic abolishes slavery in its colonies. And the plantation owners are upset. Ironically, Josephine came from a plantation-owning family.
Yeah, his wife, Josephine.
Right. So they're hoping he's going to reestablish slavery.
That's right. So all the slave owners are backing Napoleon.
Right. So
back in Egypt, all these scientists, artists, military guys are like, oh my God, how we need to get out of here and go back to France.
It gives us Egyptology, but it was a miserable expedition.
No, many died. It was awful. They were all hungry and emaciated. And Dumas and a few others had to get on a boat that they didn't even know whether it would sink or not. And it did get grounded.
Well, it's shipwrecked.
It's shipwrecked.
In Naples. And once they get to Naples, because it's enemy territory, Naples had flipped back and forth, had been in favor of the Republic, the French Republic, and then went back to the monarchy. And when they landed, unfortunate for them, they rolled snake eyes.
It's like, damn it, the monarchy people.
Monarchy people are in control now. And they end up in jail.
Yeah, in a dungeon.
In a dungeon for several years. And Alex said that he was being poisoned while he was there.
Yeah, his health had so deteriorated that was the rumor that, isn't the rumor that it was Napoleon that told them? Or
some people believe that, but of course,
it could have been locals that were
monarchy and
who were pro-monarchy, anti-republic.
Right.
But it did really seem like he was poisoned while he was there.
Yes.
And he was never the same. His health was gone.
And when he returns
eventually, he returns to France. He returns to his wife, and he's just not the same. He's trying to get back pay and money, considering he was a great general. And Napoleon was like, nope, you ain't getting a dime.
Yep. And what's interesting is his health starts to deteriorate.
Yeah, he can't work. He's in bed.
And we know now that he had developed stomach cancer, which is interesting because arsenic, which is a poison, can lead to stomach cancer.
Maybe I'll just add a little footnote here and say Napoleon got his imprisoned on the island of St. Helena, and they now think that he was slowly poisoned to death with arsenic.
Which is the very thing that they believe Alex was poisoned with.
That's right. It was a very common way to poison. If you're going to poison someone, they liked arsenic because it was hard to detect over a long period of time.
That's right. So in terms of Alex, his last years of his life were very different because Napoleon flips everything, reverses all the movement forward that the Republic had done. For example, slavery, he brought it back. Of course, there's the whole issue with Haiti. That's a very long story, which I love talking about, but we'll save that for another episode. In terms of the rights for black people and Jewish people here, Napoleon reverses things.
So before Napoleon, for about a decade, the ideals of the revolution were the law. They ended slavery in 1794. All religions, including Jewish people, were given full civil and political rights. They introduce these ideas of freedom and equality, regardless of color and religion. And then in comes Napoleon and reverses everything.
And Alex starts to suffer because of that, too.
Of course.
It affects him directly.
And because of the laws, they didn't allow black people within Paris.
Right.
And Alex Dumas' home was in that perimeter.
Yeah.
Because he had a home there with his wife. Because Napoleon had changed the laws, everything was gone. He couldn't technically be married to his wife, although he already was. He couldn't live within the perimeters of Paris, which he did.
Right.
They weren't paying him any money from the military.
Right. So he was poor.
And when his son was almost 4 years old, when he had a daughter, he had two daughters, one had died, and then a son, Alexandre Dumas, who became the great writer.
Who was I guess you could say, the silver lining in that very dark cloud.
That's right.
At the end of his life.
So Alex Dumas unfortunately died when Alex was about almost 4 years old.
Almost 4 years old. And the story that Alexandre, the writer.
Yeah, so we'll say Alexander.
Yeah, because there's a lot of Alexes. It gets crazy. Was that he was whisked away to his grandparents' house, which wasn't too far away. And he thought, something's up. So he went, grabbed his father's musket, his sword, barges into the room where his mother is sitting next to and crying and sitting next to his dead father who's lying in bed. And his mother says, Alex, what are you doing? And he says, Mom, I'm here because I'm going to go to heaven and I'm going to kill God because God killed Dad. And that was the impression of what a young boy looked at his father like he was his world. And it would be the reason we have a D'Artagnan today, because the stories that his mother would tell him of his father's heroics and his father's friends would tell him would give him the need to write these heroic stories. And he grew up poor.
Yeah, they grew up really poor. So not only did they deny Alex Dumas his money for his military service, they denied his mother a widow's pension.
Right.
And she had to work, I think, as a tobaccoist. They couldn't afford to send Alexandre Dumas to not even a secondary school.
Nothing.
They all had to work. So it's quite extraordinary how the highs that he reached and then where he died. So sad.
Right. And then his son picks up.
As you said, the silver lining is Alexandre Dumas grows up with this amazing intellect and imagination.
Right.
And he takes stories from his father and turns them into these wonderful adventure stories.
Like D'Artagnan. D'Artagnan is his father.
In the Three
Musketeers. And if you read the book, you will read a very subtle description. If you blink, you'll miss it. It says, D'Artagnan was a tall fellow with a long, dark face. That was his father. Porthos is also his father, encapsulates his father's undying love for the country of France.
That's right.
So,
and devotion to the Republic.
And
Maybe not France, but the Republic.
The Republic.
And of course, with him being thrown into a dungeon unjustly, was Edmond Dantes from the Count of Monte Cristo.
Absolutely. Alexandre Dumas imbues the story with a sense of justice, that he gets his revenge.
Well, that's a nice thing. In his son's books, he avenges all the injustices.
Right. And I think it says something to Alexandre Dumas, that he did not get over the injustice committed to his father.
Well, the book that we mentioned by Tom Rees, that's where he started. It was with the journal written by Alexandre Dumas.
That's right.
And all the information he tried to get about his father. And he didn't know the whole story because he couldn't get his hands on things because they were really hiding right from Egypt. They were trying to, like Napoleon took paintings that they had of Dumas and hid them away.
Right.
They were instantly, before he died, they were trying to erase him from history.
Right.
The incredible life of General Alex Dumas may not be taught in schools as it should be, but his spirit is kept alive in the novels of his son. Many cultures believe that if you're remembered, your spirit never dies. Alexandre Dumas' stories, inspired by his heroic father, will always live on. All for one and one for all. Now it's time for the
Fantastically Terrible Character or creature? Today we'll look at the original zombie from Haiti. African scholars have traced the term zombie to the Congolese word for soul. When people were kidnapped and brought to Haiti as slaves, their traditional African beliefs mixed with their experiences as slaves to create a new voodoo. For those who practice voodoo, the cause of a person's death is divided into two categories, natural and unnatural, like murder. The souls of those who die unnaturally linger at their grave, unable to rejoin their ancestors in Africa until the gods approve. During this period, souls are vulnerable and could be snatched up by a powerful priest known as a boko, and the boko locks the soul in a bottle which he uses to control their undead body.
Ironically, many believed they were used for undead slave labor on farms and sugarcane plantations. I wonder if this was a reflection of how tragic their situation was, that even in death their bodies were forced into slavery and their souls couldn't return to Africa.
Now that would make an interesting zombie movie. And that's it for today, you bastards. That's it for today.
I'm using the other one.
7Robots, Fantastically Terrible. Podcast is by Miguel Guerra and Susie Diaz. Our theme song is by Susie.
The best way to support our podcast is to leave a review on iTunes. This helps others to find us, and we can see your name and personally thank you live on the show. For more information on this episode, including links to everything we've referenced, please visit our website at www.7robots.com/podcast.
Another fun way to show your kindness is to read our free comics on Webtoon. Ghost Metal is a series of 100 original horror sci-fi stories that you should definitely read with the lights on. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.